with David Brooks of the New York Times. It's great to have you, David, at the gathering.
Good to be here.
Now, I was just making a list of, and this was off the top of my head, New York Times political cultural commentator, movie reviewer, NPR commentator, reporter and op-ed writer for the Wall Street Journal, senior editor at the Weekly Standard, commentator, PBS NewsHour, speaker at the gathering.
That's the highlight. That's
there you go. Thank you for that. Free plug. We'll give you some water at the end, guaranteed. How do you accomplish all of that? Some of us were joking, I bet it's a body double. How do you do that?
I work steadily. I don't work that hard. I don't think I can only write about 3 hours a day. And if I can get 1,000 words done, then I'm happy. But if you do that every day, it sort of adds up. And then I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of traveling for teaching and speaking. But I can write on planes, and I can get by with 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. So I just keep plugging away. And I really do not feel I work hard. I feel I do plenty of socializing and have fun. And so I don't consider myself a workaholic by any means. Some days I'll wake up at 6:30. I'll get my 3 hours of writing in, and it's 9:30 in the morning, and I'm done for the day.
Got the full day ahead of you.
Yeah. So, I'm not that industrious.
Well, you seem to have a very upbeat view on life. In fact, a recent op-ed in the New York Times really said, wait a second, it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually some real positive things happening. How do you not become a cynic, given the range of things that you're focusing on?
It's especially true if you're covering politics, which I do somewhat, because the political culture is so depressing and not much is happening. It's all stuck. And so if you just hang around that world too much, you do get depressed. But if you hang around technology and science and people who are passionate about what they're doing, a little of their enthusiasm rubs off. And daily life, I'm that column. I walk around New York a lot, and I grew up in New York, and I really know New York very well. And I just think the city's in great shape. And as I go around the country to Minneapolis, to Seattle, even to Detroit, I was in Detroit recently. And it's not what it was 30 years ago, but it's a little on the upswing. And so there's a lot of creativity out there. And if you pay attention to that, it's hard not to be kind of optimistic.
Rare is it I've seen you in a discussion setting, a talk setting, in which you don't have something enlightening to say, which tells me, as someone who has journalism as a background, how does he do that much research? How does he do his research? And I would be curious about your method of intake, the amount of information that you're processing on a regular basis.
Well, the first thing which I used to hate, but now I've come to value, is that I do have to write a column every 3 days. So I tell college students, imagine having a paper due in 3 days, and then imagine that's the rest of your life. That's just what I do. And that voracious need to fill that space means you constantly are on the lookout. And so I'm surfing the web, or I'm talking to people. I'm always looking out for something interesting that I can share with readers. And so that it's just a voracious demand. And maybe I wish I could relax a little, but I just can't with the job. And so I read a lot of nonfiction, a lot of books that don't sell very well, but have some interesting nuggets in them, a lot of long-form journalism that you find on the web. I read newspapers, of course, but I really pay attention to some of the stuff that other people aren't reading. And I'll sometimes get a big stack of books and I'll churn through them, not reading the whole things by any means, but skimming, looking for something that's interesting. And when you glom onto that interesting thing, then you got something.
Well, given all that process, how does David Brooks then decompress? What does decompression look like for you?
Mostly it's been socializing. I used to play golf, but I found I could either write books or play golf. I couldn't do both because they're both extremely time consuming. But I socialize. So I spend a couple days a week in New York, a couple days in New Haven, a couple days in DC. And when I'm out with the one child I have left at home, I'm out having dinner with friends. And so that's what I do to decompress.
So much of what you are writing about often is pulling in history. Where did you get the love of history?
Yeah, my parents were both academics at different points in their careers, and my mother was a historian and my father was a literature professor of Victorian literature. So I grew up with a lot of history books, a lot of old prints around the house, historical sense. And, I spend a lot of time, I used to, especially traveling around Europe, the Middle East, and you're walking in history there. And I do think the past is this precious inheritance that our ancestors created for us, the ideas, the beauty, the painting, the art, the ideas that we live in. And I do see all of life through that tradition. I'm very historically conscious. My first intimation of the divine was about the transmission of truth from generation to generation. There's something mystical. In fact, Lincoln's phrase, the mystic chords of memory, that connects us to people who are dead and to people who are unborn.
And you walked over to Yale and you started a course on humility. What led to that decision?
It's a subject I think about. I come from what I call the crooked timber school of philosophy, which is based on the idea that we're sinful, broken creatures, and we have to deal with it. And so that's an essential humility. And there are a series of writers going back to St. Augustine, but also including Edmund Burke and Reinhold Niebuhr, Samuel Johnson, who really emphasize that we're not so special inside. We have parts of us that are splendidly endowed, but parts of us are broken and sinful. And if you're acutely aware of that sinfulness, then you figure out, how do I challenge it? How do I live with it? What do I rely on to help me control that?
What was the academic reception that often is put on the opposite side of these kinds of conversations? And what was the student reception as well?
Well, I've taught it 3 times now, and I've loved it each time. The students, they come in with one vocabulary, and I introduce them to what I call moral ecologies, that in different cultures, they created different systems of living. And so the Greeks had one culture based on honor and courage. Moses in the Old Testament had another culture based on obedience to law. The New Testament gives us a different culture. And then there's the scientific culture of the Enlightenment and so on. And I don't tell them what to believe, but I say there are these inheritance, these traditions in the past of our civilizations, and one of them might be useful to you. And so that's really...
What's the reception of the students when they hear this? Is this like such new knowledge, a lot of aha moments? Is there, wait a second,
yeah,
I didn't think we were to be talking about this inside the academia?
Yeah, I think they really value it. They come with a lot of professional expertise, and they've been building up their resumes. But I wouldn't say they come with a lot of history or of given a vocabulary to express themselves morally. They're good kids. They're really good kids, and they want to do good.
Are you looking to take the course on the road, or?
I confess I love Yale. I didn't go there, but it's a fantastic university, a great community. And one of the reasons I chose to teach is because I give speeches from time to time. But with the speeches, you got a new audience every time. And with my students, I see the same faces for a bunch of months in a row until I get to know them. And to be part of a community is something. Column writing is not a community job. Speaking is not a community job, but teaching is more of a community, and so I treasure that.
You appear not to be afraid at all to launch out and talk about the understanding of faith, the meaning of faith. Where does that come from? Because it does come as a fresh air to both sides, I think, who are just saying it seems like there's someone in the middle who's willing to stand up and say something.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do is I don't talk about my own personal faith. I keep that private. I just think it's a fragile flower at this point. But I do appreciate faith. I do think, first of all, it's a great legacy of historical consciousness. And faith is part of human history in every culture. But it also gives us knowledge, faith, and especially religious traditions possess a great deal of knowledge about how to live. And I think there are certain concepts. You could be a Christian, you can be Jew, you can be Muslim, but you can learn certain concepts from each religion that even if you don't share that faith will be useful. Now, I'm not saying that's as good as being a member of the faith, but I'm saying there are things for your mental toolbox to think about, and concepts like grace, like sin. What does that mean? What does obedience mean? Humility. And so I do think, even if you say you're an atheist, if you read St. Augustine, I think you'll profit from it. If you read C.S. Lewis, I think you'll profit.
You made some interesting remarks about walls that certain communities build to actually having people understand what they believe or how they feel. There was a range of walls that you laid out. What of those walls to you is the one that you see probably most often in terms of confrontation?
Well, the walls is if someone's trying to realize themselves spiritually, what do religious people do that are not helpful? And some of it is just withdrawing from the mainstream culture. You're out there in the mainstream culture, and they're withdrawing into their own subculture, and there's no contact. And other things are, and I expressed it as a weird combination of an intellectual inferiority complex and a spiritual superiority complex, and the merger of those two. And I'm not the only person to say this. A guy named Mark Knoll wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And I do think sometimes, frankly, in some evangelical circles, certainly don't want to generalize across, but some, there's a hesitancy to really fight about ideas. Because people want to be nice to each other, they want to be good Christians. And so they want to be affirming. And that can be taken too far. You can be too nice. At Yale, we're tough about ideas. And there's a virtue in that because you really do tell you can't get away with vagueness. And so I think that's when you are not being given answers, when vagueness is tolerated, then that's a problem. Some of the other things are just spiritual condescension. When you come into a tradition and you come searching, you want to be respected and you want people to come alongside. You don't want them to look down and say, oh, I'm going to help you from above. You just rebel against that. And they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Right. But it's still a posture that's unhelpful. And so some of the ramps included just a fully lived Christian life. And, Pope Francis, I think, you don't have to be Catholic to see someone who's living the way you would want Christians to live. And that's inspiring. Some of them is just words like sin and stuff like that. Some of the ramps are, the Beatitudes. They totally flip your mind. Mm-hmm. And so to think in that different perspective is very useful. And, life is a moral drama. And sometimes our culture does not treat it as a moral drama, it treats us as a career to climb. But to have the language of moral drama is really useful.
How do you, given the tremendous background you've got, how do you want to be remembered?
I think there's a phrase, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, that wisdom only comes afterwards. And so every time I've understood my career, I've understood what happened. I don't understand what's coming. I'd like to be someone who, for his own sake, but hopefully for the benefit of some others, thinks through moral categories in a public way and helps people come up with their own moral thoughts. I think it's an undercovered sphere in American life. We have a lot of shows that I'm sometimes on about politics or about economics, but there used to be a lot more shows about morality. And there used to be a lot of prominent public figures in the world, Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Buber, and they were public figures, but speaking from a moral perspective, a religious perspective. And that's sort of a weird void. And so I'd like to try to help fill a little bit of that.
Does any of the subject matter at Yale or some of these other places where you're able to talk about your craft, talk about listening?
It's something I struggle with. I find I can listen a lot better if I'm taking notes. And the fact of having a notebook is it's a discipline. And frankly, sometimes if I'm not taking notes, a lot just washes over me, and I'm frustrated because I'll have sat through a really interesting conversation. I can't remember any of it. I haven't listened closely. And like everyone else, we're busy, and somebody comes up to you with a real personal need, and you haven't been fully present there for them. And so that listening is something I fail at often just because you're distracted. You're thinking about your next thing and stuff like that. But I have a friend, I was on the phone with him the other night, who I was explaining a personal situation, and he just asked me about 12 questions. And it was really striking how he was just pausing and asking of this and that. Before he would give advice, he really paused to listen. It's a great skill.
It's a great skill. Do you teach that?
No, I should. It's a good idea. I hadn't really thought about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're so delighted that you were able to join us at the gathering. David Brooks, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.